Hi guys, welcome back to the next episode of Books of the White Waters. My name is Eve and today I will be talking you through the books I have been reading in the month of January 2021. In January I read the total of 5 books, 2 classics, 2 fantasy novels and 1 historical fiction novel, which you will see now, including some interesting footage from the park nearby here. So enjoy the wrap up. So the first book is Frenchman's Creek by Daphne de Mourier. So we follow Donna, who is an English noblewoman, going to the countryside to Cornwall to the estate of her husband to escape her London life. What we get to know actually already in the beginning is that she was some kind of a rogue in London society. She's not exactly a proper lady, and she was never interested in being like that. That said, she actually wants to get some peace in the countryside and probably also to sort herself out. And in Cornwall, she gets to know a French pirate who's actually quite feared around the coast because he's robbing from the rich people. And there we get a kind of love story that I thought was quite interesting because it was very realistic. There is no real sentimentality in their kind of relationship, and the story actually is, in my opinion, a very feminist one, and I'm surprised that not many people actually know about it or talk about it, because Daphne du Maurier is very famous for Rebecca and for the Gothic style. You have this here as well because it's a very, very atmospheric, dark story, but it's very beautiful. She talks about the countryside, she talks about how she's learning men's stuff, like fishing, for example. And Donna decides to join the crew for one of their coups around the coast and become some kind of a cabin boy for them. I thought it's very interesting to see how realistic she showed the problems that arise whenever you have a woman on a ship. Although the story tells us the adventure that Donna has together with the Frenchman and his crew, it's more about the life of women in the 18th century and actually also later if we want to, because they talk a lot about what women cannot do because they get children and have to settle down because of them. Also the love that connects them to their offspring. Whereas men always can leave and do something else, like the Frenchman who really loves to be on the sea and have his adventures. So I thought this is a very, very beautiful story about what women go through if they really want to see a man safe. Also that they have to be realistic and have to care for their children or make sure that their children are cared for. So that means this story, this love story, has no happy ending. Donna will get back to her family, to her husband, to the very silly high society that we get to know also from the story. But we will learn how important it is for a woman to have at least one adventure like this in her life. And we feel like this is the only time that she really loved, she really risked something, and she really felt alive. So I really like this. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. So the next one is Lonesome Traveler by Jack Carrack. I must say that I'm a very, very big fan of Jack Carrack. I have read a lot of his books, so this is like going back to an old friend here. Jack Carrack is very famous for his novel On the Road, and he is the most famous writer of the Beat generation in the US in the 1950s. The book is a collection of short stories dealing with things that happened to him on his various trips, which I really love. That in his books it's always about being on the road and what happens to you there and seeing the world as a real person. In this book we have him, for example, working as a brakeman in California, or enrolling as a steward on a military ship, or doing his own private travel on a Slovakian freighter to Europe. I think the best stories are those that show him in Tangier, where he meets his friend William S. Burroughs, who was also one of the writers of the Beat generation. And his trip to France, his first trip to France, is in this story collection as well. My favorite story is probably connected to one of the books that he wrote as well, Desolation Angels, where he actually works for, I think, 3 months as a fire lookout in the mountains. And so he's living there in a small cabin on a big mountain and has to check out whether there are fires whenever there are thunderstorms, for example, fires in the forests. And then he has to make notes where the fires actually start. And as far as I know, he also has to inform the authorities that there are fires so that they can go and put them out. What I love about Jack Carrack is the way he writes about life and the way he writes about what he sees. Is always interconnected with everything that he has been reading, the paintings that he has been seeing. He has a very musical writing style, and it's a bit of, stream of consciousness as well. And the way he travels, whenever you have like travel books, you feel like most people tell you, they're living in hotels and it's more on the expensive side. And Jack Carrack never had money. He really was like you and me, and he was traveling on a budget. He was also staying in really, really bad places, living the dream of the American hobo, so to say, sleeping in the open as well. And he's actually also talking about this in this book, The Death of the American Hobo, it's called, I think, where he actually explains what is taken from us as a society if everything is checked and surveilled and people ask you just because you're sleeping outside what is wrong with you. Especially in my favorite story as the fire lookout, I think you see the fragility of life that he's musing on and also his own fears and what he wants to do with his life, what it means to be alive as a human being facing the forces of nature over there on the mountain. I love Jack Carrack. This is a modern classic, and I still hope that people nowadays discover him and see what was so important about him, that he is considered the most important writer of the Beat generation. And it's not just on the road, it's really what he was writing. He wrote a lot of books, and I hope that more people nowadays will pick him up again. I love this. It was 4 out of 5 stars just because one of the stories it was a bit slow for me, but that was the only criticism I had. So the historical fiction novel that I read this month was a translation from Dutch, Simone van der Vlucht, Midnight Blue. I hope I didn't butcher that name, so if anyone is speaking Dutch, please tell me how you pronounce that name correctly. This is a story about Katrien in the, I think, 17th century, and it's actually about the rise and fall of Delft blue pottery. I thought this is a very interesting topic. I never read something about that, and I never read something that was translated from Dutch as well. So I thought, okay, let's dive into this. We follow Katrien, who leaves her small village after the death of her abusive husband to go and work as a maid in Amsterdam. There's a lot of gossip in her village because people think the death of her husband was a bit strange. There was something going on there and it was very sudden. So there's a lot of talk there, and she wants to escape this. Before she goes to Amsterdam, she meets Matthias von Nyland in an inn, who actually gives her a recommendation letter so she can actually introduce herself to his brother, who is a very rich merchant in Amsterdam. Matthias is usually going on business tours for his family, and that means at that time, of course, accompanying the ships on their trade tours to China, for example, or at least the East. And so we know that Matthias is more or less someone who's on the road, and the attraction they feel to each other is not exactly something that might have a future. So Katrien goes to Amsterdam, and through things that happen there, she will meet Rembrandt and loads of the painters from that time. She later has to go to Delft because there is a secret in her past that she wants to hide. In Delft, she gets to know another brother of the Nyland family who has a pottery, and there we actually get into what this book should be about, Delft Blue, and she becomes a painter actually an apprentice and a painter for them in the pottery. And they start to have huge success with the porcelain that they are actually producing. Although you have to know that at that time, the porcelain from China was all the rage and everyone wanted to have this. Not everyone could afford it. That's why they started to have a lot of success with what they did actually in a more affordable version for the Dutch nobility. What I liked about this book is, first of all, that the translation, I don't know how the original is, but the translation is really a matter of fact. I really liked this. It was not very flowery because Katrine as a character is not very flowery as well. So I really like that the translation fit the character. It's a feminist story as well because we can see that she tries to make her way into the business. She tries to make her way in general also away from the village because at that time people thought she would be remarrying someone and living on the farm there instead of selling it. But we also see, and that's of course what we want to see in historical fiction, that it is researched very well, that at that time it was not easy for a woman to go around alone and also not being married, for example. What we also see is that the plague is arriving in the Netherlands and how this is affecting her family, her new life, and also the people that she tries to run away from. I really like this. I also like that we have Matthias coming back in the end, and of course there is some kind of showdown if you want to, which is not a showdown. I like the realistic approach in this book. I never read something about Delft Blue, and I must say I have a thing for porcelain, so maybe that's a reason why I wanted to read this. I found this book in the National Trust souvenir shop at Chatsworth House near Sheffield, where I actually went because it was used as Mr. Darcy's home in the 2005 version of Pride and Prejudice. That was something I did last summer, and I found this book there, and I thought, okay, if the National Trust wants us to buy this, then why not? I will buy this. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. Just because the pacing in between was a bit weird sometimes, but that was the only criticism I had, and I really liked it. I hope that more people will pick up this translation, and maybe someone of you has read the original and can tell me whether this was actually very famous in the Netherlands as well. The adult fantasy novel that I read in January was Garth Nick's The Left-Handed Booksellers of London. Now, this was actually some kind of a title buy for me because I thought, how awesome is this title? And what does it mean? I can only say that the story absolutely lived up to the title. We follow Susan here, who is a punky art student and goes to London because she will start studying quite soon. And she tries to find her father, whom she never met. We are in the 1980s, some kind of alternative 1980s in Britain and London. And already in her first night, Susan is sucked into the business of the left-handed booksellers of London. Some kind of wrong time, wrong place situation. And that's how she gets to know Merlin. As you can imagine, his name is already giving away some of his abilities there. He is a very fashionable young man. He also has a sword and guns and is usually killing some fantastical villains. We get to know what left-handed booksellers and right-handed booksellers are, and that it seems that the magical underworld in London has an interest in Susan and wants to abduct her. So that's the premise of the story, so to say. And Susan tries to find her father, and Merlin tries to help her and also tries to keep her alive. It was absolutely hilarious. I've never read a fantasy story like this. It's urban fantasy, which is something I usually don't read. I'm more like the, horses, swords and sorcery. But that's exactly why I actually took it, because I thought this has some kind of a James Bond vibe meeting folklore and fairy tales. And that's exactly what happens there. We encounter goblins and the Mayfair and all kinds of legends that you can imagine, and how the author connected them to make sense in regards to the story. It was absolutely amazing. I couldn't believe it. It was really, really entertaining. entertaining. I was laughing the whole time, and there was like one twist after the other, and you could not predict anything. I really, really loved it. It was a 5-star read for me. It was one of the best fantasy standalones that I have ever read, and I have never read anything of this author before. So Garth Nix is someone completely new to me. I heard loads of good things, even like I think Brandon Sanderson or Joe Abercrombie. Loads of people know him already, and they say, you know, he's very, very original. I can only join the choir here because this is absolutely true. As you might have seen in my Christmas book haul, I have already bought another book of his, and I'm quite interested to read this as soon as possible because I have the feeling this will be very strange as well, and I will see new takes on the fantasy genre in his books. I really, really like this, and I hope people will read this book. It's so good and it's so funny, and even for people who maybe do not like fantasy because they don't like, you know, the monsters and they don't like the big clashes and the wars and you name it. I think this is something that could be appealing to loads of people if you like quirky stuff, if you like different stuff, and if you also like fantasy where you can laugh. So you must have an interest in irony here. I really liked it. Pick this up. The young adult fantasy novel that I read is Sarah J. Maas, A Court of Thorns and Roses. Now, this book is very famous, and also the series, and has usually either haters or lovers. There's nothing in between. In my case, I found myself in between and was kind of surprised that most people actually have very radical opinions about this. First of all, this is a fairy story. In this story, we follow Fair, who is the daughter of an impoverished nobleman, and she tries to get her family through the winter by going into the woods and hunting. She hunts a wolf, she kills a wolf, which was not a wolf, but a fairy, and as a punishment, she gets abducted to fairyland. There she meets the court of High Lord Tamlin, who she, of course, finds very interesting, although there is some kind of hatred before she gets to be interested in what's actually going on there. And there's some kind of a love story that is evolving there, and we get to know that there's some kind of a sickness in fairyland that takes away the abilities or the powers of the fairies. So Fair is actually seeing kind of rituals that are done at the fairy court, and later she will be sent home. But of course, as you know, she's a young woman. She wants to know what's going on in fairyland because she was sent home since people think she's in danger. And when she comes back, nobody's at the court anymore, and she finds out where she can find her High Lord and rescue him. I thought that this was a very tropey story. I was not really surprised by anything that happens. I thought the protagonist, Fair, is very annoying because she clings a lot to her past and her family, although her family never really cared for her, and she's going about the same things over and over again. We shall believe in a kind of love between her and the Fey Lord, but I thought there's zero chemistry there, and also the sex scenes that we have in this story are not very interesting, and they don't make much sense because on the one hand our protagonist is absolutely kick-ass and has no problem with being naked, and on the other hand it makes a big difference for her what's going on with the High Lord. And then also when we get to the court where she's actually displayed half naked all the time, and on the other hand has to solve some ridiculous riddles and do some ridiculous actions to make sure that her High Lord is not killed, or that other people are not killed, or that she's getting out alive. I thought it was not very original. I mean, it's very hard to be original, I get that, but I did not understand why so many people were loving this story and thought that Sarah J. Maas is one of the best authors ever in YA fantasy. I thought that the second part of the book was more interesting because there was action and more revelations about the courts and the back politics there, so that you can imagine in the future, because this is the first book of a longer series, that there might be something interesting happening if you really make it through the first book and if you decide to go on and read more of the books that come later. I was was not really caring in a way, but I heard that the second book shall be very interesting and that we get out of the young adult and more into the adult section there, which probably also indicates that there will be more sexuality as well. I bought the second book. I hope that it's good and that I might understand what other people like about it. But I had to give this book like 3 out of 5 stars. It was okay, but it was nothing special. And Sarah J. Maas has to really, really be good in the next book to make me pick up the rest of the series, because I'm really not convinced yet, and I actually doubt that I will be. But as I said, I give her a chance, and let's see what's happening when I have read the second book, which is, I think, A Court of Mist and Fury.